Further debate. The member for Parkdale High Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always an honour to rise, and particularly about this bill. It's been a long road. 7 years ago, actually 8 years ago, was when it all started. And when the first bill was tabled, that I tabled, and then as a member from Timmins, James said, 4 more bills came after that, including 1 second reading. It's okay. 1 second reading, and here we are. So a long time, and sadly, a large number of deaths, too. In fact, this year alone, there have been 10 suicides of first responders since January the 1st. Last year, there were over 30. This is an ongoing problem, and we're here collectively to talk about potential solution. I want to acknowledge a couple of people who've been sitting here very patiently. Bruce Chapman, who is the president, and Chris Hoffman, who's the vice president of the Ontario Provincial Police Association. I think they deserve a round of applause. They and their association have been here really since the very beginning. The very first iteration of this bill was for all workers. That didn't get a lot of traction from across the aisle, so we tightened it up and we talked about those workers who are most affected, first responders. Because as you've heard the Labour Minister say, they experience post-traumatic stress disorder twice as often as other workers. So that's why we started there. Doesn't mean we should end there, and I'm going to speak a little bit later about some of the amendments that we would like to see put forward. But for now, let's talk about the bill before us, Bill 163. When I think about this bill, there are so many images that come to mind, but I'll start with the first one. The first image is of a young woman. Her name, Shannon Bertrand. And Shannon was here on Thursday when the government announced its intention to finally act on this situation. Shannon came into our office, our constituency office, and was met by our constituency staff first before they brought her situation to my attention. And I know many members here see a lot of people in their constituencies. There's, in Great Britain, your constituency hours, Mr. Speaker, are called surgeries. And I think we can ring with that because often a lot of those meetings can be pretty painful. There's not a lot we can do for a lot of folk, especially since we're not in government. We do our best. We fight for them, but often we have to let them go saying, you know, that's life. There's not a lot of justice in the justice system. Or, you know, good luck with the Ministry of Health. Good luck with the Ministry of Labour trying to get something done. But this case was different. This case was different because it was so compelling. Shannon is a young paramedic. She's back at the job now, and that's a good thing. Her claim with the WSIB has gone on, is still going on, Mr. Speaker, for 10 years. Wow. 10 years. She is proof positive that post-traumatic stress disorder does not need to be terminal. You can get treatment. You can get over it, even fighting against all the odds, even not with WSIB's assistance. You can get back to work. You can survive it. But what an ordeal. So when she came in, we thought simply what anybody would think, I think, that is, this is wrong. There is something absolutely unethical and immoral and wrong about asking our first responders to run into danger day after day after day, and when they come down with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is, after all, a disorder, it's mental but is like any other, we don't protect them. We don't treat them with dignity. We don't give them the coverage that they should get by rights. Because PTSD is a workplace injury. I'm going to repeat that often, because that's the simple truth that we're speaking about today. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a workplace injury. It comes about as a result of your work. In the very same way, and the very template for this bill, was with firefighters. If you remember back, again, it was a bill we first introduced from the New Democratic Party that certain kinds of cancer should be covered for firefighters, because a lot of firefighters can run into a plastimate fire, to a chemical fire. Not all of them are going to run out with a cancer, but some of them are. And to try to prove that you contracted cancer from one plastimate fire or another is virtually impossible to do. Now, just imagine with post-traumatic stress disorder, you're already suffering from trauma, and then you're going to go before panels of bureaucrats to try to convince them that you got that post-traumatic stress disorder from one incident of trauma at one point and not any of the other trauma that you've experienced in your life. And trust me, by the time you get to that point, there's been a lot of trauma if you're a first responder. And I've got the time to do it, and they deserve it. So I'm going to read the stories of our first responders who've sent them to us. And we have stacks of such stories, I'm sad to say, from first responders all across this province who reiterate time and time again of how they try to suck it up, how they try to get on with the job, how they try to just, go back out there, and they just couldn't do it. Now, how does that manifest itself? Well, yes, it's a DSM category disorder. Yes, you need a psychiatrist or a psychologist, finally, to diagnose it. But it might manifest itself in any number of ways initially. A standard way, drinking too much. My husband spent some time just between high school and university working for the Waterloo Regional Police. They hired him because he could speak Portuguese, he's Portuguese, and he wanted to ride his motorcycle. So it was a perfect job for after high school, thought he wanted to be a cop, thought he wanted to go through and become a detective, actually. So, he went out there. And in his very brief time on the force, decided he wanted to go to university because he had to be a detective. And then he got waylaid at university and ended up becoming an academic, God forbid. Anyway, so he's now an academic. But for that year that he was on the force, he said, and this is Waterloo Regional, this isn't, 11th Division, 14th Division, 55 Division in downtown Toronto, Waterloo Regional. And he was on a bike. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't dealing with murders. He was dealing with traffic tickets. And he said in his department there was about a 50% divorce rate, and there was a huge and high rate of alcoholism. Now, think about it. I'm going to tell you about what some of our, just traffic cops put up with in a little while. But there's an insight. There's an insight. And I can tell you that although, I'm a proud New Democrat and proudly on the left, you'll never, ever hear anything out of our household but esteem for our first responders, for our police, for our paramedics, and for our firefighters, for our dispatchers and our corrections officers, parole and probation officers as well, because we know in our household what they do. I'll be telling you stories in a minute. Maybe I'll start with one of them. Let's start with a situation that goes back many, many years. So I'm 12 years old. I had a nightmare actually leading up to this, because children are very sensitive and they pick up on things in adults. But I picked up on something about my stepfather. He had served in the Second World War. He had actually been one of the liberating forces for Auschwitz. So you can imagine what that was like. I remember the pictures that he had, the photographs. They were of nightmares that he encountered when he actually walked into Auschwitz. At any rate, clearly this is a man who had never dealt with post-traumatic stress disorder. There wasn't even a word for it back then, quite frankly. It was called shell shock if it was called anything at all. Anyway, I had a nightmare about his bedroom where he slept, and in my dream I would walk up the stairs, I would get to the door, but I wouldn't go in. One morning he didn't appear at breakfast, and he was very military. He always was at breakfast at a certain hour. So as a young girl, I remember the dream. I walked up the stairs, I opened the door, and discovered that he had shot himself through the head. And I can tell you that then, having probably post-traumatic stress disorder myself as a teenager, that I had a very tumultuous teenage period. Again, undiagnosed, not a word for it. We didn't have the diagnosis back then. But let me tell you what happened after that. My cousin was an RCMP officer, and my cousin was called to the scene. And he came in and dealt with it. And remember, this is somebody that he knows, somebody in his family. And then he dealt with all my mother and all the other relatives and the trauma and the hysteria and the upset and the suffering. My cousin did that, and he was very young at the time. He was in his early 20s. I think back on him right now. Teddy Patrick, shout out to you. Living in Georgetown, shout out to you. He's now retired. But he was the one who came. Think of another traumatic period. 1992, my husband at the time was coming home late from work. He worked in advertising. He's coming home on his bike, driving too fast, hit the brakes too hard. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, a young traffic officer came to my door, was living in the beach back then. And of course, you always know there's something wrong when the doorbell rings at 3 in the morning. And she told me that my husband had died in a bike accident down there on Lakeshore. And that young woman, let me tell you about that traffic officer. That young woman held my family's hand, sat with us during the night, took me the next day to identify the body, was there throughout the entire process. I, at that point, was a clergy person myself in United Church ministry, and I can tell you no clergy person that crossed my path through that whole ordeal did as much for our family as that young traffic officer. And I think about her life. I think about what she does and did on a regular basis to go to homes like mine, to knock on the door, to tell people that kind of news with small children in the house over and over and over again, not to mention what she's seeing on the road, what she's experiencing. So tales of trauma. Here are some others. Not my words, they're this woman's. This is the story about my friend Dave. He is kind, generous, and would go to the moon and back to help others. And yes, he is also the quintessential advanced care paramedic, or at least he was. In 2012, he received the Governor-General's Emergency Medical Services Exemplary Service Medal. You can get a feel for the kind of remarkable human Dave is through his media announcement. Move ahead to 2014. Another assault on the job at a call resulted in Dave attempting suicide twice. Fortunately, Dave is much better at saving the lives of others than taking his own. Outpatient mental health support followed by a 2-month inpatient program and then more outpatient therapy, Dave tried to return to the front line in 2015. It did not last long, and another incident at work sent Dave on leave again. His employer didn't help to support Dave through this process. Dave did all the work himself with lots of help from friends and family. In December of 2015, his employer terminated his employment. Wow. How does one go from receiving a Governor-General Service Medal to terminated employment in a period of 3 years? Dave's WSIB claim for PTSD was denied. His attempt to return to another inpatient mental health program was denied, as his benefits did not cover the next program that was recommended for him, and with diminished income while he was still employed, receiving long-term disability, this program was out of his financial reach. This has all left Dave with a great deal of uncertainty, a lost career, and denied rights that he is desperately fighting for. Is this, she says, the way we treat those among us who choose a calling that comes with such personal risk, people who put their own well-being below the desire to help others and to save lives? One of the things that I hear about quite often from folk is, why did it take so long? What was the pushback? This is such a no-brainer. Why didn't the government do this? Why didn't we get action on this sooner? And when traveling the province, when talking to people, first responders and others who were supportive of the bill, the only explanations I could hear were, again, talk to, first of all, the stigma that people didn't really believe that a mental health disorder was really a disorder like any others. And then the second one, which was much more sketchy, it seems to me, can be such a thing, was people who thought that first responders might fake it if they had this presumptive diagnosis, if they got to claim that this was a workplace injury, and that then would cost the system more money. Mr. Speaker, people don't often verbalize that, but that's in essence what people were saying to me. That's why I'm reading these stories. That's why I'm telling you these stories, because I think we can enter in to a little bit of the life of a first responder and forever put the lie to that kind of response. In terms of money, because sadly it always comes down to money, Alberta, that has had this legislation on the books since 2012, is a perfect case in progress of a place that has presumptive legislation, that has declared this a workplace injury, and it hasn't cost any more. In fact, if anything, because PTSD is a treatable disease, hey, I'm standing here, aren't I, and others too, because you can get back to work if you're treated with dignity, if you're given the help you need. If the money is there and the coverage is there, you can get back to work. You can get over it. And by the way, you're going to pay for it anyway. Because if you don't get WSIB coverage, guess what happens? You end up like the man in the story, and guess where you end up? On Ontario Disability Support. So the government is going to pay for it. The people are going to pay for this one way or the other. The only question is whether with dignity or not. Here's another one. This is in his own words. For 7,300 days, I responded to hundreds of 911 emergencies, delivering babies, rescuing victims of vehicle collisions, responding to factory and farming accidents, resuscitating vital signs absent patients from cardiac arrests, chokings and drownings. There were bloody traumas from bullets, blades, bludgeoning, bottles and bias. Too many suicides and soil-stained lives from drugs, alcohol, prostitution. In 1998, I faced a deranged soul with a 12-inch butcher knife. I should have died that day. I cared for a human angel, a double lung recipient whose tiny adolescent body rejected her gifts of life. She refused her second chance of life because her friends at Sick Kids were waiting for their first chance. She died soon after, not because she gave up, but because she wanted another child to experience hope and the fresh air of a new day. Her final wish was not for herself, but for the kids she left behind, video games and controllers for those still strong enough to play life's game. The media spread the word and her wish was fulfilled. Sick Kids was inundated with electronics. The ward was furnished, and her last wish granted daydreams to her friends that she left behind. I tried several times to pay my respects the day of her funeral, but each time my radio blared another 911 call, and I never got to say goodbye. I cared for a young woman trapped in a burning car, her residual effects of horror from a head-on with a DUI pickup truck, all but her face. Her big blue eyes and blonde hair was left untouched. The rest of her youthful life was burned beyond recognition, turned charcoal, twisted sinew, and visible porcelain white. Hips, femur, tibia, and foot, now skeletal bone. We talked about her life, her love for a man, soon to be wed, and she told me of her pregnancy that was now a hollowed, gaping wound. And finally, before we placed a breathing tube gently beyond her vocal cords and into her lungs, she shared with me a phone number to a wayward, neglectful mother. I called her last request and found out why this woman was absent most of the young woman's life. Vile tone and talk greeted my ears. We sped with her dying daughter. This estranged mother would soon see her warped body, and this woman would wonder with shocked eyes and gaping mouth what unheard message from daughter to mother was left unsaid. She just wanted to say goodbye to you, I whispered and screamed within my brain. That night, the trauma tables in ER were full of broken bodies from the DUI, and each life we attempted to save that horrific night died one by one, all except the DUI. And then one night for me, something broke. No kidding. You know, another story I was thinking of when I came in today was a myth, an ancient Greek myth about Achilles. We all sort of know it, but his mother was a goddess, Thetis, and she wanted her son to be immortal. She didn't want Achilles to ever die. So she took Achilles and she dipped him by his heel, she held his heel, and dipped him into the river Styx to give him immortal life. And when she pulled him out, there he was. Achilles, the hero that we've all heard of in Greek myth. And he was a hero. He led troops in to fight Greece. He was universally acclaimed, thinking he was immortal, but he forgot one thing. She held him by his heel. There was a flaw. And guess where the arrow landed? On Achilles that took him down, his heel. Made me think of Tima, Counter Trust, and all those good people. Heroes are human, too. There isn't a hero without a human flaw. There isn't a hero out there that is so strong they can withstand everything and anything without being hurt in some way. That person does not exist. It is our duty as legislators, it is our duty as those people who pass laws to make sure that they are all taken care of when that flaw, whether it be physical or mental, whether it be cancer or post-traumatic stress disorder or a broken leg or a broken back, happens. That's our responsibility. Okay, another one. Firefighter this time. And this was sent to us, by the way, by MPP Michael Harris. Andy Cunningham still recalls every detail of the day 20 years ago when he came across an infant who drowned in his parents' tub. The Toronto address, the time of day, the little boy's name. Decades later, the veteran firefighter is still haunted by the ghosts of his work. As my depression grew worse, I started to have nightmares, flashbacks. I call them my ghosts. It was all the bad calls that I had run that I had never thought about for years and years. I had never given them a second thought, and here they were intruding into my life, Cunningham said. Cunningham was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder during the last few months of 2012 after years of struggling to focus or even make it into work on time. But the symptoms of PTSD, which can range, as we've heard, from depression to flashbacks, may not appear right away or be caused by a single incident. In Cunningham's case, it was almost 20 years before he sought treatment. His symptoms included flashbacks to a specific moment of a call or endlessly second-guessing decisions he made on the job. Eventually, his supervisor noticed and asked if he needed help. Cunningham reluctantly accepted. I was scared, he says, what people would think. I was scared of appearing weak. I know that mental illness is not a sign of weakness, but there's still an old prejudice from when I was brought up that, you know, people who are crazy get locked up. He spent 2 months in Homewood Health Centre, a treatment facility in Guelph that specializes in mental illness and substance abuse treatment, and he says, during my time in treatment, I met a lot of first responders and military people, and even people from all walks of life who are being treated for PTSD, and they all said the same thing, that asking for help is the hardest part. That's a telling story, because the minister was talking about prevention and all that we need to do, and it's true. But one of the pieces of the bill, Mr. Speaker, that I think needs some amendment is that 24-month provision, because I really think that what we have to look at here is a longer time frame, so that people, right now, people we know, cases in my office, who were denied by WSIB but certainly need that coverage, need to be able to go back in, need to be able to table those requests. They need help too. So that 24 months period we need to look at, and I think we need to look at it seriously when we go through the chapter and verse of this law. And Mr. Cunningham's story really brings that home. Here's another story of another firefighter in this case as well. My husband Tony has been a Hamilton firefighter for 30 years. It was a job he loved and one he was cut out to do. He had many close calls, having all his hair burned off, caught in flashovers and electrocuted. But in February 2002, something happened that would change our lives forever. His station was called to an apartment building at 181 Jackson Street in Hamilton. While Tony was on the main floor, the 2-inch concrete ceiling collapsed on him and he was buried. After some time, he was found by his brave co-workers. I got a call in the middle of the night telling me there had been an accident and I was to go to the hospital. It seemed like a nightmare. At the hospital, Tony had visible physical injuries. Little did we know other injuries, not visible, were soon to follow. Over the next couple of days, I noticed a change in Tony, his moods, drinking, things just out of character. He noticed this himself and called our family doctor, Laura Blue. She immediately knew Tony suffered from PTSD. She referred him to a local mental health clinic. She notified the city as well as WSIB that Tony had PTSD. WSIB acknowledged his claim for PTSD, but no help was offered. So Tony faithfully went to see the therapist at the clinic, even though they are not specially trained to handle PTSD victims. He returned to work. The next couple of years were years of taking different drugs to try to help with the disorder. Some worked, some did not. Our children at this time were in their early teens. Tony's mood swings, drugs, and the disorder disrupted our family and certainly affected our kids. 2 years ago, Tony's PTSD had seemed to become worse, and we separated. During his period from home, he was almost out of control. Speaking to our doctor, this type of behavior is typical of PTSD. What did not help was the fact Tony was involved in a car accident where he was trapped, and this further aggravated his disorder. We have since got back together, and the kids and I support Tony 100%, one of the lucky ones in that regard. We can only guess how hard it is to have this awful disorder. Tony was taken off of work by the doctors, but his claim was not accepted by WSIB for almost 2 years. So, another story. A couple more, but before I go into them, I want to say some thanks, because thanks are in order. I want to say some thanks, and I'm going to read off the organizations. It's amazing when you think you have an hour, you think you have lots of time, but I'm running out of it. So I want to make sure that these names get into the record. You've already heard the Ontario Provincial Police Association is here, the Ontario Professional Firefighters Association, Police Association of Ontario, Ontario Paramedic Association, TIMA Conter Memorial Trust, OPSU, Unifor, CUPE, Civic Institute of Professional Personnel, ATU, all have been very seminal in terms of supporting all the iterations of this bill, and finally, this bill itself. So, let's talk about Bruce Kruger. He's an OPP officer. And by the way, You know, these were all the stories sent where they said, please use our real names. Please tell our real stories. We've got boxes of stories where they're not comfortable sharing their real name and their real stories. Boxes. So when you talk about the numbers, and when you see the suicides, which is, of course, just the tip of that ugly iceberg of what happens to those who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder for first responders, you know, you're speaking, when you're speaking about this bill, to thousands out there. Bruce Kruger, he was here, by the way, for second reading, so shout out to him. He was also here on Thursday when the government brought in this bill. Insists on having the perfect seat. He's fled airplanes, cried in restaurants, and rearranged furniture at friends' homes, all for the perfect seat. That seat is backed against a wall, so no one can attack him from behind. Most of the time, the retired OPP officer appears to be enjoying an idyllic retirement. He has 4 grown children, 11 grandchildren with Lynn, his wife of 43 years. He has a charming home, bed and breakfast on the banks of the Muskoka River. He also runs 2 joint Swiss Chalet Harvey's franchises, one in Bracebridge and one in Huntsville, and he's the official town crier of Bracebridge. He seems successful and normal in most every way, but, says Kruger, it's a mask. He calls himself the Great Pretender. He's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder connected with his 29-year OPP career. He suffers from anxiety, depression, guilt, and periods of rage. He traces back his PTSD to the violence he experienced, which includes shooting and killing a prison escapee who was pointing a shotgun at his partner in 1977, finding slain OPP officer Rick Verdecchio frozen solid in a snowbank with 3 bullet holes between his eyes in 1978. Kruger, by the way, stayed with that body to protect the scene for several hours. Coming upon the bodies of a father and his 6-year-old son who had drowned in 1978 and having to row the bodies back to the shore of Healy Lake. Before retiring in 1999 at the age of 51, he had witnessed countless other horrors, gruesome accidents, sexual assaults and suicides, some involving children. He's now on 2 medications, an antidepressant, a blood pressure drug that stops the vivid nightmares that used to leave him screaming and panting. The nightmares, Kruger said, were mostly fictitious gunfights, and I'd be right in the middle of them. Occasionally, he has appointments with a Toronto psychiatrist. Because he can freeze up in certain situations, Kruger carries a card in his wallet notifying people that he suffers from PTSD and that he, quotes unquote, might need a moment to settle. In police work, says Dr. Randall Bottom, these are guys who are exposed to life-threatening stressors as part of their job. He was, this doctor was a senior psychiatrist for the Canadian Armed Forces from 1996 to 2010, and now he works with police officers as well as veterans. I've heard police say, when I pull a car over, I don't know what I'm going to be getting into. That's anxiety-provoking in itself. Anna Baranowski, a clinical psychologist who works with police officers in private practice, says that they make 10 to 15% of her client base, police officers. She says the key is to catch the disorder early. We've heard about that. So that's Kruger. Suffice to say that he's well enough to have shown up here to see what all his hard work has come to and what all his honesty has come to. Imagine having to live with that and having to speak about it all the time. And I didn't mention this, of course, and this is seminal. The reason that Officer Kruger has to sit with his back against a wall is that his fellow OPP officer, Tom Coffin, was murdered in 1997 the killer came from behind and shot Coffin in the head at close range while Coffin was off duty at the Commodore Hotel in Penetanguishene. The shooter's been charged had been charged by Coffin for impaired driving in April 1996. So that's why Officer Kruger, now retired, has to sit with his back against a wall. I'm going to go back actually to one that I didn't read. Find it because they're not all like that. Yeah, I'll look for it in a minute. Tomorrow afternoon, I'm meeting, by the way, with the widow of Darius Garda, the Toronto police officer who recently took his own life. And I think we are all aware of the front page of the Toronto Star that told his story, a particularly awful one because he's so young, 29 years old. And again, didn't get the treatment he needed. As people would describe him, the ultimate good guy. He was kind, very soft-spoken, recalls Katerina Martins, who was a fitness instructor with the police service during the early years of Garda's career. Physical fitness-wise, he was one of the strongest, she added, a hard worker. In April 2010, Garda was involved in an incident that seems to have left a profound mark on him. He was among a group of officers who pursued an erratic driver down to the Portlands, near where Garda's body was found in the water on Thursday, and cornered him. After the driver clipped an officer with his car, police opened fire and shot 32 rounds. The driver, a 50-year-old father of two, was killed. It was later revealed he had been on medication for schizophrenia. Garda testified at the inquest into Duda's death. That was the victim. I never saw in my career a police officer cry on the stand, but he did cry, and it was genuine. He really felt something wrong had happened, that a man lost his life. This police officer, he was looking at things through the perspective of a human being. The whole courtroom stopped for a bit. We stopped and said, wow. That was the defense lawyer speaking. A wonderful son, brother, uncle, and friend who took his life, his own life. Here's a happy story. December 3rd, 2006, a woman had thrown her 2-year-old, happy in context, off of the Morningside Bridge at the 401. Shortly after throwing her 2-year-old off the bridge, this woman, after fighting with bystanders, had successfully thrown herself over the Morningside Bridge onto the 401. I was the very first paramedic to the 2-year-old. I was the second first responder to this child, as the first responder was a fireman who I found kneeling beside this child as a child hung on to life, slowly dying. I never found out what happened to that fireman. I did not have to fight with WSIB in having my claim accepted as part of PTSD. My supervisor immediately filed a WSIB report, and I was allowed by WSIB to have a leave from work. I was allowed to be off on stress leave. I sought and received psychological counseling thanks to WSIB, and with a couple of weeks of therapy from both professionals, family and friends, I successfully returned to work. That's how it should work. And that's what this bill and all those years of trying will result in. We all hope here. That kind of story, that kind of treatment with presumptive legislation. I have a few minutes where I want to talk, and I'm sorry that the Labour Minister isn't in the room, but I know he'll hear about it, about workers' rights generally in the province of Ontario, because this is part of that. And first responders, at the end of the day, are part of the general workforce of this province, Mr. Speaker. In a sense, they're the lucky ones because they have associations, they have unions that fight for them, that come here and lobby for them, that have their best interests at heart. But you know, about 2 out of 3 of every worker in this province doesn't have an association or a union that goes to bat for them. And one of the things that we're really charged with in terms of looking after workplace safety and workers' health, this is a piece of it, it's a big piece of it, and I'm glad, is to look after the other 2/3 of the workers that don't have someone to fight for them, to help them get that body to fight for them. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the kinds of things that we as New Democrats have fought for so long. Anti-scab legislation, card check certification, because we know wherever there is high rates of unionization, that there are higher rates of safety on the job. So we need to be always looking beyond those workers that have the ability to come and lobby us, to all those other workers. And I can tell you the situation right now in Ontario is grim. About 50% of the workers in this province are precarious, temporary contract. And those wonderful articles that the Star has been putting out on a drumbeat basis about precarious work and about temporary work and about contract work points out how dangerous that work is and how little coverage they have even to be able to collect their wages, because those are the other stories we also hear in our constituency office. We hear stories from them, particularly from racialized communities, new immigrants, where they don't know their rights and where they're not being paid to work. People are working for free, or they're called contractors, and then they're not paid. The reason I mention this, I have the opportunity to do so. This is a Labour of Ministry bill. But there was a landmark decision just recently for a couple that worked as quotes-unquote contractors that sued and won. So the courts, Mr. Speaker, are weighing in where this government fears to tread in looking after workers' rights generally across the province of Ontario. So it's really important to highlight that as well. Let's go back to the bill and talk about amendments, because there are some, I think, that need to be made. It's interesting, and our paramedics pointed this out, and I want to assure them that even though in the bill, and we had a technical briefing this morning, I want to thank the ministry staff for doing that, that even though it's not spelled out that part-time paramedics are covered, they are. So it's spelled out that part-time firefighters are covered in this bill. Part-time paramedics are also covered. Very important to note that, because again, precarious employment, a lot of our paramedics in Ontario are working for several different employers and are working on a part-time basis. So I wanted to let them know that we checked into that, that's covered. But auxiliary police members, special constables, I was thinking about our own Sergeant-at-Arms here. I think he is ex-RCMP, but he's no longer RCMP. We think about the brave, Sergeant-at-Arms on Parliament Hill, who performs such a great duty for this country. He is a special constable. He may not be covered by the letter of this law. So I would appeal to the government when they're looking at amendments to look at special constables, special forces, auxiliary forces as well. We need to make sure that those folk are covered too, particularly our own Dennis, because after all, Mr. Speaker, he puts up with us. So we want to help him. That was another thing. Also, I've already mentioned the fact that this 24-month period is not nearly long enough, that we really need to look at post-traumatic stress disorder, and because of the stigma that has been in place, it takes people a long time sometimes to come forward. Sometimes it's after they've left the force. Sometimes it's after they've left the force because they cannot work any longer. And this would not necessarily cover all of them. And I think in light of some of the stories that I've read out today, that's particularly tragic, because these really have been the gladiators that have fought for this bill. These are the ones who brought their stories to my office, and I'm sure also to the Minister of Labour's office. And we need to make sure that all of those claims are covered, that there is some grandparent clause here to some of those. And I get you can't cover everybody and you can't go back forever. But this bears some examination, and this bears some closer look. So again, that's an amendment that I would certainly want to look at. You heard others speak in our own caucus about other frontline workers. One of the frontline workers that is covered by the bill, that didn't get a lot of mention today, by the way, were dispatchers. But also, and they are covered by the bill, so they know. But 911 communications operators should also be covered. So sometimes the job title itself might exclude someone from the presumptive legislation. So again, I'm just putting out there so the government can look at this so that we make sure that nobody's left out. That even if their job title is something slightly different, if they're doing the same nature of the work, that they should be covered. And that's really important. Another group not in here, probation and parole officers. We were absolutely pleased that corrections officers were included. They have been lobbying us as well as the government for many years on this bill. And I've always said to them, only the government can make this law. Now that the government is making it law, let's make sure that we include everyone that needs to be included. And I think it's important to look at, for example, some of our nursing staff that work on the front lines of their jobs too. The Manitoba legislation covers all workers. As I said, my original iteration did too. We're not even suggesting that. We're just suggesting that first responders, wherever they work, whatever line they're in, if their job title excludes them, that there's room for expansion on this bill. And again, if the concern is cost, which is always a concern when it's not spoken out loud, one can say again, reiterate again, that you are going to pay for those who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder one way or the other. You can either do it with dignity or you can treat them badly and re-traumatize them, which is what has happened in the past. You're going to cover them, whether it's on social assistance or whether it's through WSIB. They're going to cost you money. There's no question about that. What haven't I done? I also want to thank, I really want to thank the media on this. They have kept this issue alive on the front pages. For example, with Constable Garda was on the front page. Their constant pressure has made this happen. I do want to thank the Minister of Labour. I know he's gone to bat for this. I want to thank the leader of the Progressive Conservatives, who I think his first question in the House was on this bill. I want to thank especially, of course, our own leader, Andrea Horvath, who's been there since the beginning 7 years ago when I first tabled the bill and has always been supportive of this. I want to thank some people in my own community. I want to thank, he's now gone on to teach at the police college, but Peter Lennox, who was the superintendent of 11th Division, who said to me, completely out of the blue, off the cuff, he said, you know, I would like the day to come where we could recognize, and we recognize those who have fallen in the line of duty, those who have also taken their own lives but who have been heroes. That really stuck with me. That really stayed with me. It's a powerful message, and I think that for firefighters, for paramedics, for police, for dispatchers, corrections workers, and others, that we really need to keep that in mind. That, as Timo would say, heroes are human too, that there is no such thing as a hero without a flaw. The Select Committee on Mental Health and Addictions was mentioned. And I want to mention it too because they did fantastic work on that committee. They traveled around the province and they made, I think, some 23 recommendations out of that committee. Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to say, only 3 have been acted upon. Only 3. So that's the broader scope of mental health and addictions. That's certainly the broader scope, but it's an important one because unless we deal with the stigma of mental illness for everyone, unless we actually deal with this the way it is and not the way we pretend it should be, unless we get rid of the wait lists for services, and trust me, all those folk who come here looking for services for their children, who are suicidal, their children who have addiction issues, those folks shouldn't have to mortgage their homes to send them to private care, and that is the case for many of them right now in the province of Ontario. So there's a bigger bigger picture here. And the Mental Health and Addictions Committee did that hard work. Let's not let their report gather dust on a shelf. Let's make sure that the government acts on all those recommendations. And that was many years ago. So again, I want to thank everybody who was on that committee. I know our own member from Nickel Belt was, France Jalina, and she in particular has been an advocate for that. So again, let's make sure that happens. And of course, it goes without saying that all of the stakeholders who've been active and all of the other jurisdictions, Alberta, Manitoba, and by the way, some good news, others are also looking at it. New Brunswick is looking at it. Nova Scotia is looking at it. I mean, I'm hoping that because of the media around this in Ontario, that all the other provinces come on board with similar legislation. This is a workplace injury, no matter where you perform that work. So all of the other provinces, I think I've only trended on Twitter in Canada twice in my life, and this was once, when this announcement was made, and it was right across Canada. So right across Canada, we need action on this, not just in Ontario. So hopefully others who are listening to this debate in other provinces will step up and act on this too. What else to say? Finally, let me end with a story that happened actually within the last month. And this time I won't tell you the name for obvious reasons. I'm here at Queen's Park. The House isn't sitting. We're just in to have some meetings with some stakeholders and constituents. My executive assistant comes running in. She said, I have, we'll call his name John. We have John on the line. I knew who he was immediately. He was an officer who suffered with PTSD, and he said he's going to kill himself. He said he's had enough. He's waited long enough for action from this government. He can't get WSIB to listen. Nobody's listening. He's lost his wife. He's lost his family. He's lost his job, and he's about to lose his house. There's no point in going on. Now, I don't know how many of us in this assembly have received calls of potential suicides in their offices. I can tell you as a young church minister, I used to get them, but this is the first one in my 10 years here that I received something like that. And so what did I do, Mr. Speaker? And here's the irony. I phoned 911. I phoned 911 to get first responders to respond to the call of a first responder who was about to take his own life. And I can tell you, I bet there was some rivalry between police, paramedics, and fire about who would get there first. I'm not going to weigh in on that one. I'm not going to weigh in on the role the dispatchers played either, because I know they did behind the scenes. He was safe. He was saved because of the actions of those who run into danger when we run out, but this was for one of their own. How sad must that day be? Potentially, how traumatic must that moment be when you are called into a call for someone you may have worked with at some point, and you've seen what their life has become because of this disorder, and here you are having to save them, and think of what he went through to make the call, because his training was all about helping others, not asking for help himself, certainly not like that. That would be the last thing a first responder would ever want to do, would be to call, make that call. And in fact, he said specifically, do not call 911. Specifically, he said, there's no help for me, do not call them. Because quite frankly, you can get the psychology here. You can understand why he would say that, because he was the one who used to make those calls. He didn't want to put his fellow officers or anybody else through that call. He didn't want to be that person, but he was that person. And the only legal, reasonable thing to do for us was to make the call. So this is the conundrum. And hopefully, need I say it again, after almost 8 years from the time that Shannon Bertrand walked into my constituency office, the first tabling, the second tabling, the third tabling, the fourth tabling, the fifth tabling, Mr. Speaker, when joyously it passed second reading and these seats were filled with first responders, till last Thursday, there wasn't a dry eye in that room. When we finally heard from the Labour Minister, we finally heard from the House Leader what we had been working for, those many years, that finally a very simple act would take place, an act that I can tell you will save lives. And that is simply to declare that post-traumatic stress disorder is a workplace injury. Because for all the prevention in the world, and there should be, and for all the programs employers should bring in, and they should bring them in, and for all the new science about how our brains work and our bodies work and what happens, I'm telling you, just like in the military, our first responders still have to be protected from this, because there will be that person who comes down with PTSD no matter what we do, because of the nature of what we ask them to do. Heroes for sure, humans for sure. I like to think of that Achilles image with that immortal but for the heel, immortal but for the fact that, guess what? He was human too. So to all the first responders out there, particularly I'd like to dedicate this afternoon, really, and all of this debate, to the families of those who didn't win the battle with post-traumatic stress disorder, to all of those families who lost someone in the line of duty to this dreaded disease, and it is a disease. To you, I say finally, we're getting action. This is a glorious day. Revel in it, rejoice, and know that that death was not in vain, as no first responder's death is. We thank them. We thank you for all that you do for us. Finally, we're doing something for you. Thank you.